Welcome, friends. Tell me, where are you listening from? And the time, is it daylight where you are, or the hour when the post is long delivered and the curtains drawn? In Flaxborough, a lonely heart's ad slipped quietly into the morning paper. Just a gentleman seeking mutual respect in matters domestic. Innocent enough, unless you've lived here as long as Inspector Purbright. Because in this town, even the personals can be a prelude to something decidedly criminal. The Flaxborough Advertiser, for all its pretense to civic importance, rarely contained anything that could be construed as mysterious. Its pages, yellowed at the edges before they were even delivered, tended to concern themselves with poultry auctions, commemorative teaspoons, and the municipal rearrangement of dustbins. Yet on that damp Thursday morning, Inspector Purbright's eye was drawn, not unwillingly, to the small type of the personal column, lodged between an offer of piano tuning and a plea for information about a lost cat with only 3 whiskers. It read, 7331. Gentleman of settled means seeks lady of refinement for mutual respect in matters domestic. Discretion valued. Reply, Box 24, Advertiser Office. Purbright reread it twice. The first reading gave him the bare bones of the request. The second served to convince him that the phrase mutual respect in matters domestic was one of those formulations which, by aspiring to propriety, hinted vaguely at its opposite. At the police station, it was Sergeant Malley who, having been shown the clipping, remarked that the gentleman sounded like the sort who expected his tea poured in a clockwise direction. Purbright did not reply, preferring to leave the remark hanging like a stray sock on a hedge, in case it later proved useful. By mid-morning, word of the notice had found its way, as all mildly titillating items did, into the conversation at the Temperance Café, where Miss Lucilla Teatime was partaking of a pot of lapsang and a currant bun that she was dissecting with surgical precision. "It's the tone of it," she told her companion, Mrs. Phibbs, whose attention was divided between the conversation and a slice of Battenberg. Not a word about romance, not even companionship. I dare say the lady of refinement, if she applies, will find herself engaged in the provision of dusting schedules and the supervision of grocery deliveries. Mrs. Phibbs tittered in a way that suggested she was half hoping to hear more and half anxious to be overheard. Miss Teatime, who could calibrate her voice with the accuracy of a naval signal lamp, allowed it to carry just far enough to reach the neighboring table. There, 2 members of the Ladies' Guild were performing the delicate operation of stirring tea without betraying that they were listening. By the time Purbright encountered Miss Teatime in the High Street later that afternoon, she being on her way to inspect the window display at Gedge's Millinery, the advertisement had already undergone that subtle transformation which occurs when a fact enters the social bloodstream. "You saw it, of course?" she asked, without needing to specify. "I did," Purbright replied mildly. "I suppose there is no law against seeking mutual respect?" "There oughtn't be," Miss Teatime conceded, though one wonders if the gentleman has considered what the reciprocal arrangement might entail. Ladies of refinement, in my experience, are rarely content with mutuality alone. Purbright smiled faintly, the smile of a man who had been offered an opinion that was simultaneously too much and too little. He let the subject drop, not because it was uninteresting, but because in Flaxborough it was always prudent to allow matters to steep before tasting them again. The following day, a small ripple passed through the quieter circles of the town. Mrs. Darbury, who for the past 9 years had presided over the flower arrangements in St. Swithin's Church with an authority bordering on horticultural tyranny, announced that she would be stepping back from her duties for personal reasons. These were said to be delicate and therefore beyond discussion, though the word delicate in Flaxborough was as good as an invitation to speculate. Mrs. Darbury's withdrawal from the floral front line was regarded as an upheaval. In a town where civic life proceeded with the inevitability of an old clock, such a change in the rhythm was noticed. It was remarked upon in the grocer's, whispered about in the lending library, and, in at least one case, recorded in neat copperplate in the minutes of the Thursday afternoon Bible study group. Purbright, for his part, noted the timing of Mrs. Darberry's retirement with the same inward nod he might have given to the arrival of a low cloud before a shower. He had, in his years of service, developed a modest respect for the interconnection of apparently unrelated events. At the police station, the matter surfaced only once, in the course of Malley's report on the week's minor disturbances. 2 complaints about bicycle lights, a disagreement over the ownership of a ladder, and the theft of 3 bottles of ginger beer from the back step of a grocer's shop. When Malley reached the end of his notes, Purbright asked, as though idly, whether Mrs. Darberry's absence from the guild had been remarked upon by her fellow members. Malley, who had an instinct for his superior's understatements, confirmed that it had, and that the general opinion was that Mrs. Darberry had been preoccupied for some weeks. The nature of her preoccupation was, naturally, a matter of polite ignorance. Polite ignorance, Purbright murmured, being a more strenuous exercise than frank curiosity. The remark was not explained, nor was it intended to be. Purbright had learned long ago that certain ideas, like seeds, grew best when buried. 2 mornings later, Purbright passed the window of the advertiser office and observed, through the dusty glass, the young woman who handled classified ads for the paper. She was sorting envelopes with the brisk absorption of someone engaged in the movement of small sums and smaller confidences. The inspector paused, considered the propriety of an inquiry, and then walked on. The time was not yet ripe. In the town, life continued with the surface placidity that Flaxborough did so well. The public library maintained its quiet, the post office its queue, and the church its draught. Yet in certain quarters, the Ladies' Guild, the Conservative Association, the Committee of the Floral and Horticultural Society, there was a subtle lean in conversation, a tendency for words to tilt in the direction of the lonely heart's notice, even when the topic at hand was the weather or the rising price of coal. It was during one such conversation, overheard in the grocer's, that Purbright caught the phrase, "One never knows what one is letting oneself in for." The remark, delivered by a lady whose capacity for hint was exceeded only by her appetite for hinting, was immediately and elaborately disclaimed by its speaker as though she had been overheard by the Archdeacon himself. That afternoon, the inspector returned to his office and read the notice again. Its plainness, he decided, was its most artful quality. To those who wished to see nothing amiss, it was unexceptionable. To those inclined to suspicion, it was a pebble in the shoe. He placed the clipping in a drawer beneath a bundle of unrelated papers, correspondence about parking permits, a note on the scheduling of the annual police concert, and a memorandum about the repainting of the station's front door. It was not a matter to be acted upon. Not yet. The faintest of draughts, after all, can take hours, or days, to be felt as a chill. And somewhere in Flaxborough, whether in a parlour thick with antimacassars or a sitting room furnished with rented gentility, someone had already written a reply to 7331. The advertiser office had been built with the sort of bleak practicality that assumed all human affairs could be reduced to columns and totals. A bell on a coiled spring trembled above the door. A counter of ink-scarred oak ran the length of the room, and behind it, like a ship's crew resigned to modest seas, the staff performed their tasks with small pens and smaller expectations. The air smelled faintly of gum arabic and envelopes that had known better days. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Malley presented themselves that forenoon under the peaceable pretext of discussing a matter of municipal placement. In effect, this meant the police concert poster had twice been printed without the time, and once with the year, though the year given had been wrong. Such errors were blamed in this office on the union of haste with economy. One could disapprove of neither without losing one's job. The counter was attended by a young woman whose hair suggested its owner had experienced both an early buzz and late astonishment. She greeted the visitors with the cautious diligence common to those who must daily translate excited intentions into payable copy. Purbright performed the slight courtesy of removing his hat and smiling as if the advertiser were a dear aunt prone to lapses. "We shan't detain you long, Miss Fallow," she supplied. "If this is to do with the police concert, Inspector, it is already a topic of some mourning. Mr. Keylock says the bassoon was misled by the typesetter. They are notoriously at odds." "Indeed," said Purbright, with a glance at Malley, who had not previously suspected the bassoon of sedition. "But in fact I come to ask a small question about the placement of civic notices and, if it is not an imposition, the degree to which correspondence addressed to numbered boxes is handled with discretion." Miss Fallow adopted the expression of a minor official being asked to define the oath of office. "We value discretion very highly, sir. It is almost included in the price." A door behind her opened. Through it advanced a man whose neatness of collar and complexion implied an internal struggle between thrift and pride, from which pride, while not victorious, had at least been allowed the better soap. This was Mr. Keylock, the clerk in charge of classifieds, petty cash, and, as it transpired, several opinions. He apologized for the omissions in the police poster as if they had been acts of God, and led the visitors to a narrow table under a calendar depicting a Normandy landing craft incongruously loaded with rhododendrons. "One cannot control every factor," he said. "We are at the mercy of the municipal grant. No, do not be modest, I will say it. The council pays as though everything could be done with leftover ink." Purbright, who had hoped for exactly this sort of irrelevance, agreed sympathetically. He could see that Mr. Keylock had placed himself before a small pile of letters as a speaker might align himself behind a lectern. The letters, addressed in hesitant hand to box numbers, promised to be a kind of human sediment, what the town let fall when shaken by loneliness. "I was wondering," Purbright said, "whether box replies are collected at fixed hours or irregularly. The question has its origin in the misplacement of a civic announcement and should not trouble anyone's conscience." Keylock was soothed by the phrase, "should not trouble anyone's conscience," which sounded like a certificate of character. "We allow collection at any reasonable hour," he said. "The one exception is when a party is unknown to us, in which case we require proof. Oh, nothing laborious. A name to match a signature. Perhaps a telephone number that rings. It is a matter of prudence rather than suspicion." "Prudence," Purbright murmured. "A cousin of suspicion who married well." Keylock did not hear or preferred to ignore epigrams during business hours. He sorted his letters with the slow gravity of a magician, refusing to reveal a trick. "As to the notice that I believe engages your interest," he withdrew a thin folder of pink slips and carbon papers. "Here is the booking sheet for 7331. Sergeant Malley leaned a fraction nearer, careful to seem dimly curious rather than avid. The pink slip showed a hand that had aimed at flourish and acquired illegibility as the next acceptable best. The words "paid in cash" had been written with that special firmness by which clerks record both the transaction and their attitude to it. "Could you recall the advertiser?" Purbright asked, as though they were discussing an uncle one met only at weddings. Keylock considered. "Gentlemen," he said, with a meaning that included both a style of tweed and a manner of holding the door while calculating one's ascent. "Early 50s, I should say. Jacket too warm for the day. There was a scent, not cologne, something hair tonic in the old style. He asked that the wording appear exactly as written. He resisted the offer of a more alluring tone. Our romantic refinement package, you see. He preferred mutual respect in matters domestic." "Which is alluring to a certain temperament," Purbright said. "To a temperament with a budget," Keylock replied, almost tart. He paid for 3 insertions and 1 week's use of box 24. When I mentioned that some prefer a fortnight, He said a week would either suffice or discourage him from unprofitable sentiment. Keylock's voice almost admired the phrase, even as it disliked it. He signed, "Well, you can see for yourself. We requested a name for our books and were given one which, as names go, had an air of rehearsal." "Would you object," Purbright asked, "to our looking at the carbon?" Keylock hesitated, then took up the top sheet and bent it away like a curtain. The blue-tinged carbon below showed the same flourish, but weaker, as if the confidence of the pen had evaporated between the original and its shadow. Near the bottom corner, a faint smudge had transferred, a small diagonal line through a zero in the date, then a correction, producing the effect of someone accustomed to a different notation. Malley, whose virtues included eyes, said nothing and said it steadily. "We receive all sorts," Keylock went on, encouraged by his own thoroughness. "Most are what one might call aspirational. A lonely widow who enjoys music but means hymns, a music lover who enjoys widows but means the other sort, and the occasional man who uses the word adventurous to cover a range of deficiencies. In this instance, however, there was a particular calm. One does not, I assure you, receive calm from the truly romantic." "I wonder," Purbright said, "whether anyone has replied." Keylock showed a professional smile that closed like a drawer. "The contents of boxes are confidential by custom, but I can say that box 24 has been visited twice. Once by the advertiser, who took an unhurried look at what was there, and once by—" He paused, either for effect or because he disliked facts that would be spirited out of his control. "A lady whose gloves were immaculate. She inquired whether there were any replies intended for immediate forwarding. We do not forward immediately. It leads to disappointment by post." "Immaculate," Purbright repeated. The word held a surprising cold. "Did she give a name?" "She did not," Keylock said, "but she gave me the impression of someone who has one for every occasion." This seemed an adequate description of Miss Lucilla Teatime, who at that exact hour was in Gedge's millinery, examining a display of hats as though they were affidavits. The window had been rearranged overnight to exhibit a species of felt that suggested both propriety and audience. Miss Teatime tried one on and considered the reflection as if she were being interviewed by it. Gedge's was a shop designed to prevent sudden decisions. Mirrors were placed at angles that required a woman to imagine herself from multiple vantage points, none of them quite conclusive. The assistant, a patient girl with a ribbon at war with her hair, hovered like a footnote. "Something that acknowledges winter," Miss Teatime said, without being trapped by it. The assistant produced a hat the color of counsel's robes. Miss Teatime set it on, tipped it to the left, and permitted herself the smallest nod. "This," she said, "suggests that attention, should it be paid, will not be misplaced." She paid. Miss Teatime never bought a hat without intending it to be noticed, and, more crucially, noticed as she wished. When she left the shop, the assistant, tidying ribbon with the expression of one entrusted with delicate evidence, concluded that a person had just equipped herself with an alibi. Back at the advertiser, Mr. Keylock had reached a point in his argument at which civic budgets necessarily suffered. He had, by method of gentle indignation, arrived at the conclusion that all misprints could be traced to the council's tendency to call economy efficiency, and to insist that a line of type could be both narrower and clearer. "It is a principle," he said to Purbright, "that when one pays less for ink, one obtains a lighter truth." "A melancholy idea," Purbright said, standing. "We are grateful for your candor, Mr. Keylock. You have been both discreet and helpful, a combination not always attainable in the same person." Keylock, mollified, produced a tiny bow. He allowed, in a gesture reckless for a clerk, a brief look at the box 24 tray. It contained 2 envelopes, cream, of the sort bought by those who speak of stationery, as if it were furniture. On the back of one, where the gum met uncertain commitment, a scrap of thread clung, fine, grey, almost invisible. A remnant of glove, perhaps, or the fray of household twine. Purbright's eyes rested there the length of a heartbeat before returning to their customary mildness. He declined to open the tray further, and so remained within both the law and Mr. Keylock's goodwill. "We shall not intrude," he said. "The police concert will survive without absolute punctuality." They took their leave. Outside, the day had become the sort of afternoon that makes the street lamps consider their duty prematurely. A mist began to ornament the edges of things. Windows, rails, the inspector's sleeve. The advertiser bell jangled behind them with the same anxious hope it had expressed for 20 years. Malley, who had preserved his silence like a packed lunch, ventured, "Hat shop, sir." "Shortly," said Purbright. They walked without haste past the ironmongers and the photographic studio, where infants were posed upon rugs without their knowledge. "You will have noticed," he added, "the small habit of the pen." "The diagonal through the zero," Malley said. "A foreign manner, or one adopted by a man who wishes to be thought precise." "Precision does sometimes need advertisement," Purbright said, "as do other things." At Gedge's they found only the persistence of the assistant's ribbon and a faint, careful perfume the shop had adopted the moment Miss Teatime departed. Purbright asked whether a certain hat had been purchased and received confirmation with a pride that did not entirely belong to the assistant. "A lady with excellent posture," she said. "She chose what chose her, if you understand." Purbright did. He thanked her with a gravity out of proportion to haberdashery and walked back into the mist. At the station, he wrote nothing. He set his hat upon its peg, resisted the temptation to label it, and looked for a time at the map of the town that hung above his desk. It resembled the inside of a modest clock. Streets as cogs, houses as teeth, and small lives going about their turns. Somewhere in the mechanism, a new wheel had been fitted. A gentleman who advertised calm, a lady whose gloves did not err, and a clerk who had provided accidentally a glimpse of thread. Purbright thought, very mildly, of the word suffice, and how rarely it did. He wondered, not to the point of speculation, only to the edge of it, whether Miss Teatime preferred her hats to be recognized first by men or by women. He reached then for the morning's advertiser and, finding the page, allowed himself the small skillful pause of a man waiting for a tune to reappear. There, beneath the Lonely Hearts column, the compositor had introduced a correction. Box 24 now bore, in tiny type, an asterisk. At the foot of the column, a note explained, modestly, that an error in last week's heading had placed one advertisement among household services by mistake. Purbright lifted his eyebrows a degree that would not have discomposed a child. "Household services," he repeated, not aloud. It was, he reflected, a kind of placement some temperaments might consider ideal, and it posed, in its humble way, a question that would not quite settle, whether the gentleman of mutual respect had intended romance to resemble employment, or whether someone in the advertiser office had recognized in his diction a category more accurate than kind. The mayor's parlour aspired to grandeur by means of heavy curtains and dark portraits that had never been told they were not ancestors. The tea was hot enough to command respect. The biscuits were of a constitution that argued for rationing's dignified afterlife. Inspector Purbright, who had been summoned on the pretext of discussing pedestrian crossings, was introduced instead to Mrs. Darbury's cousin, a woman whose hat bore plumes with views. "My dear Inspector," she began, "I suppose one ought not to speak, but silence is often mistaken for consent, and I have no wish to be thought consenting. It concerns my cousin. A friendship, most unsuitable, has arisen." Purbright, who rarely interrupted a speech until it ended of its own weight, nodded with an interest so mild that it encouraged continuation. "A widower," the cousin said, and the word carried, as it always did in Flaxborough, a slight implication of speed. "Of mysterious means. One does not inquire directly, of course. It would be vulgar. But absence of evidence is not evidence of virtue. Do you agree?" "I think," Purbright said, "that virtue tends not to issue receipts." The mayor, who had poured with municipal generosity, looked relieved to have found himself not responsible. He would, if asked officially, deplore unsuitable friendships in the same weary tone in which he deplored the motorway. But Mrs. Darbury's arrangements were, he felt, largely floral, and therefore ecclesiastical. "There has been," the cousin went on, "a lowering of the standard in the church flowers. I say it without malice. The lilies on Sunday appeared to have retired early, and the hydrangeas were, if one may say so, domestic. My cousin has always maintained that some blooms, while admirable by the yard, do not belong in public worship." Purbright said that gardens, like congregations, carried within them a variety of opinion. He sipped. The tea performed that reliable miracle of restraining further eloquence by filling the mouth. "Of course," the cousin said eventually, "one hopes for the best. Yet there are addresses being visited, and it has come to me, how is of no importance, that furnished flats have been inspected. One does not inspect a furnished flat for conversation." The mayor looked at his portrait nearest the mantel as though it had anticipated this very moment and chosen to be unresponsive. He produced a cough that would do for either sympathy or smoke. "I am obliged," Purbright said, setting down his cup. "You have done your duty to propriety by confiding in authority, and authority will, in return, do its duty to discretion." The cousin seemed cheered by the phrase as by a window opened after a sermon. She permitted herself a sigh that expressed both relief and further availability. On the pavement outside, the air had become civic again. Purbright walked back to the station through a town that knew how to be sedate even in its curiosity. By the time he placed his hat on its peg, Sergeant Malley had appeared with a notebook that had never yet provoked scandal but had witnessed it build. "Your errand?" Purbright asked. "As requested, sir. Discreet inquiries." Malley sat, and his chair did not resent it. The man in tweed, variously described as tidy, polite, and a bit as if he'd been ironed, has looked over several furnished places in the last fortnight. Nothing extravagant. 2 rooms, sometimes 3, always inclusive. "Inclusive," Purbright repeated. A hopeful word in property and marriage. Malley consulted his list. The agents recall him asking about linen arrangements, weekly change, preferably with the same laundress. He wanted rent by the week in cash. He inquired after the thickness of the curtains and whether the front door had a chain. "He is either particular," Purbright said, "or occupational." The proprietress at Roseley Mansion stated that he admired the aspidistra. He remarked that a plant suggested continuity. Malley's voice did not indicate whether he found this remark reasonable. "Continuity does look well in a sitting room," Purbright said. He took the notebook, not to read it. The lines already existed in Malley's precise recitation, but to attach the weight of paper to his thinking. "Any names given?" "2, Malley said. "At Pantile Court, he was Mr. Salloway. At Roseley, he signed the visitor's book, Elwyn Sallows." The second felt more willing to exist than the first. "The hand is steady. The initial on each is a figure 8, taught manners." Purbright considered the cousin's plumes, the lily's early retirement, and the maid-of-all-work tone of mutual respect in matters domestic. He had the impression of nets being hung not to catch fish, but to imply a river. "And Mrs. Darbury?" he asked. "Seen in the vicinity of Baffin Terrace on Tuesday. Baffin includes 2 buildings of furnished flats and an institute for the morally hopeful, currently closed for repairs. She carried a parcel that could have contained either cakes or napery." "The moral hopes of a building rarely improve with repairs," Purbright remarked. "But parcels are a civil way of going somewhere one cannot otherwise explain." He thought of the Ladies' Guild, where explanation was both plentiful and insufficient. There, the quiet uproar had begun with an absence, the absence of blooms worthy of remark. From this scarcity had grown a certain tone, at once solicitous and indignant. Minutes would be written, they always were, and would record concern while evading cause. By late afternoon, concern had indeed married stationery. Purbright happened upon the guild's secretary outside the post office, addressing envelopes with the important rapidity of one who translates feelings into stamps. "Bad news travels on postcards," she announced to no one in particular, "but our arrangements require an envelope." "Is there," Purbright asked, "a difficulty with the church flowers?" The secretary, having been handled carefully, bloomed. "Not a difficulty, Inspector. A pressure. The usual order with Trotter's nursery was cancelled without adequate notice. We were compelled to supplement from Mrs. Lynde's garden, which is an excellent garden, but not, strictly speaking, consecrated. There have been comments." "In writing?" "In whispers," she said, "though I shall receive the whispers presently in writing for distribution. We do try to accommodate all sensibilities. It becomes one. But standards are like hymn tunes. Once misplaced, they are the devil to find again." "You have my sympathy," Purbright said, and meant it. He walked on to Trotter's nursery, where a man of peat and decency confirmed the cancellation. "We had the order as always," Mr. Trotter said. "Then a message came by hand yesterday. No signature, but the paper was good. Said we wouldn't be required this week and perhaps not next. We don't take offence at God's garden going without us for a Saturday, but it isn't like Mrs. Darbury to change course. She's a woman who believes in arrangements." "By hand?" Purbright asked. "A lad," Trotter said. "Blue bicycle, red cheeks, the sort that forgets to shut a gate and then remembers to return and shuts it twice." Purbright thanked him and wandered back toward the station, where Mally had the waiting look of a man whose information was house-trained. "I asked at Baffin Terrace," Mally said. "The caretaker, Mrs. Woolard, reports that our Tweed gentleman inspected number 5 on Monday. He commented favourably on the sofa's sobriety and tested the hall's echoes. He also asked, casually, whether the back stair was used by tradesmen or by persons who did not prefer to be seen." "How very comprehensive," Purbright said, "and how confidently phrased for a man whose jacket forgets the season." "He left a card," Mally added, and passed across a rectangle of thin board that had aspired to be thicker. It bore a name, Elwyn Sallows, and a telephone number containing more dashes than digits. Beneath the number, small and almost apologetic, the words "Evenings Preferred." Purbright set the card down as if it were a specimen that might fly. He was not much impressed by the vanity of printed names. He had always considered ink an unreliable witness. But the phrasing, even in its low voice at the bottom, had an air of employment notice rather than entreaty. Evenings were preferred by men who worked in the day or by men who required the day to be unobserved. He let the matter drift in his head while other business was performed. A request from the Rural District Council to discourage the habit of attaching notices to municipal trees. A letter from a lady inquiring whether the bylaws permitted parakeets if they behaved as budgerigars. He responded to both with the ceremonious impartiality that safeguarded a town's belief in its own smoothness. By the end of the week, the Ladies' Guild had produced, with commendable efficiency, a newsletter. It contained a paragraph of thanks to those who have borne with us during minor supply difficulties, and a sentence praising the rector's sermon on temperance, though no one had followed the logic beyond the second example. There was also a small appeal, almost shy, for anyone with surplus green glass vases to lend them until the customary order is resumed. Purbright, who read newsletters as if they were testimonies, suspected in that appeal a quiet confession. When an institution solicits the contents of sideboards, it has exhausted the florist. He made a point of walking past Roseley Mansions on Saturday. The building kept its propriety by means of brass that had been polished into the middle of next week. Through the glass of the entrance, he could see a small lobby with 2 chairs that would not have forgiven comfort and a fichus that, if not dusted, at least did not show it. Miss Lucilla Teatime emerged from the doorway a moment later, as if conjured by the idea of chairs. She wore the new hat that suggested attention would be properly directed and did not start on seeing Purbright. She preferred to treat people as if they had been expected for some time. "Inspector," she said, with the subdued pleasure of a woman who has found the very phrase she had intended. "What a respectable building. It must be weary with it." "Respect wears heavily on some," Purbright agreed. "Are you acquainted here?" "I have acquaintances everywhere," Miss Teatime said. "A town of this size demands it. One never knows when a photograph of a cat is required at short notice, or a reliable char." "Or a vase," Purbright said. "How you anticipate," she murmured. "One of the guild's appeals, no doubt. I do my small part to prevent hydrangeas from suffering indignity." She bid him good afternoon with a modulation that implied evening would be preferable. As she turned away, the caretaker inside the lobby opened the letter rack and took out 3 envelopes. Purbright could see, because he was trained to look without appearing to, that one of the envelopes was addressed in a firm, controlled hand to Box 24 Advertiser Office, which was not a home and so required journeys. Back at the station, Mally produced the week's gentle marginalia. A note from the advertiser that the asterisk had been removed from the Lonely Hearts column after a typesetting clarification. A memorandum from the borough surveyor declining to comment on gossip concerning staircases, and, folded neat as a napkin, a photocopy supplied discreetly by the caretaker at Pantile Court. "It is the visitor's sign-in," Mally said. "I did not request it, it volunteered. Our Tweed gentleman's entry is there, Monday last." Purbright examined the tidy line. Elwyn, Sallow, 11:30. The surname had recovered its final consonant and mislaid an S. The time had been altered by the writer, a 0 struck by a thin diagonal before being rewritten boldly. The correction produced the familiar effect of someone trained to cancel a European 0, and then remembering that in these parts such zeal was not required. "It's a habit that travels," Mally observed. "More faithfully than friendships," Purbright said. He refolded the page and slid it into a manila envelope without annotation. The envelope joined others in a drawer that had room for more. He sat for a while, letting the day draw its own conclusions. If the widower of mysterious means had come to Flaxborough to discover mutual respect in matters domestic, he had chosen an efficient route. Rooms inclusive, evenings preferred, a door with a chain, and curtains with ambitions. The church flowers had suffered a tactical retreat. The guild had gone cap in hand to the green vases of supporters, and the mayor's parlour had engaged its plumes. Yet the advertisement, dry as a biscuit, calm as a ledger, remained the thread from which this small tapestry had begun. Romance had not entered the room. Employment had sent its card. Purbright rose at last to collect his coat. On his blotter lay the guild newsletter, half-folded, its type set with the nervous virtue of charity. Near the bottom, after the appeal for vases and before the reminder about the autumn fete, a single-line notice had been inserted. Furnished accommodation occasionally required for visiting speaker, references available, discretion appreciated. The phrasing should have passed without echo. It did not. He read it twice. The second reading did not improve its innocence. Then he turned the page and, for no more than a second, wondered whether a visiting speaker habitually preferred evenings, and whether he signed time with a diagonal through the 0. The letter arrived with the morning's assortment of official envelopes and private improprieties. Circulars urging the constabulary to consider modern filing systems, an indignant note from a gentleman whose garden gate had been interfered with, and among these, a small envelope of pink paper as self-conscious as a blush. Its address, 7331, had been stylishly inscribed, the numerals formed like ornaments. The postmark suggested a distracted hand at the sorting office, and the stamp had been applied with the reverence generally reserved for coronations or wedding invitations from people one has not met. Sergeant Malley placed it upon Inspector Purbright's blotter with the tact due to oddities. "This one appears to have mistaken its road, sir." Purbright, who disliked opening letters, not meant for him in much the same way that a vicar dislikes opening bottles in public, tilted the envelope toward the window. The perfume performed with more confidence than the writing. It was not the heady flourish of romance, but a careful decision. A fragrance composed by someone who preferred to seem delicate without being thought weak. "Forward it to the advertiser," Malley suggested, already reaching for an evidence slip that would lend virtue to a small discourtesy. Purbright considered. The address, while plain, was in context a kind of cipher. Letters to numbers had a way of moving along on other people's patience. He turned the envelope over and held it against the desk's lamp. A watermark became faintly legible within the pink. Chapelle and Grieve. Stationers, High Street, Lincoln. The discovery was not useful. It seldom is when first made. He set the envelope down. "I think," he said, "we shall act the postman with an apology, and perhaps, if time permits, the chaperone." Malley asked nothing. One of his talents was to imagine reasons without burdening them with questions, a rare quality in a subordinate, and rarer still in a friend. He placed the envelope upon a folded sheet so that any new fingerprints would be his own, and returned it to Purbright with the air of helping along a reluctant child. The Swan Hotel, toward which the misdirectedness evidently wished to proceed, was a building so confident in its carpets that it had allowed them to teach the walls what color to be. The lounge contained chairs that disapproved of immoderate postures and small tables that looked permanently ready for a respectful sherry. A fire was lit. It had been lit for years. Its brightness made no statements. It merely upheld standards. At 3:45, which was when the letter had requested confidence, a woman sat in the chair nearest the fender. She had the posture of a person who has been careful with her belongings and is, through habit, careful with herself. Everything about her seemed faintly retreated. The color in her face, the mink of a collar that prospered without triumph, the gloved hands that rested one upon the other as if they had agreed not to move unless asked. If she resembled a bird, it was not one of the songbirds. The resemblance lay in a readiness to flick away from alarm. Purbright approached as a man might approach a neighbor's gate in a high wind, gently and prepared to be gusted at. He did not introduce himself immediately. In such rooms, introductions often arrived before the person did. "Good afternoon," he said with mild formality. "Forgive me. I am here as the bearer of a small apology." She looked up, and relief flickered. First surprise, then gratitude, then a polite effort not to be seen feeling either. "You are not," she began, and stopped. She had intended a name, and the name had balked. "But you are the police." "On my day off," Purbright said, removing his hat as if he had been invited. Or at least pretending so in order not to alarm people who dislike seeing duty in a lounge. She smiled, very slightly. "I'm not one of those people, Inspector. Duty has its place, even in lounges." She glanced at the envelope now in his hand, and performed a small sigh that was almost a yawn. "It came to you then?" "It wandered our way, yes." He set it upon the table between them without sliding it back, so that its availability would feel like a courtesy rather than a test. "If you are Mrs. Venn," she supplied, and watched his reaction as some watch a window to see if a draft is real. "Widowed. Not recently." "I'm sorry," Purbright said, with the kind of courtesy that neither overestimated nor undervalued grief. "You wrote to 7,331. She nodded once. "I will be precise, Inspector. I wrote to a number because one cannot safely write to a name. Names have friends." She glanced at the fire as if recalling other rooms where fires had spoken too loudly. The letter was only to ask for a conversation, in confidence. I intended no mischief. That, Purbright said, is the least actionable intention in the county. He waited. Mrs. Venn's restraint was not the prickling watchfulness of a liar, nor the theatrical humility of one seeking absolution. It was the quiet of a person who knew that words must be rationed if they were to buy anything. "The gentleman," she said at last, wrote in a way that suggested he knew what people wanted to hear when they do not wish to hear much. Mutual respect, such a noble dullness, and matters domestic, which can be made to mean anything at all, provided one is alone when agreeing to it. I thought perhaps I could hear him speak before anyone I know was obliged to explain why they had seen me. "The advertiser," Purbright observed, "offers both promise and cover." "It offers a structure," Mrs. Venn corrected gently. "One arranges one's risk inside it." Purbright, who appreciated a mind that wore good shoes, asked whether she had any acquaintance with a gentleman in tweed. Early 50s, a jacket more loyal to October than to April. "I have acquaintance with the sort of man who is not that, but wishes to be thought it." She paused, then added in the same tone, "And I have had acquaintance with a town in which such men, if their affairs go the wrong way, become a committee." "Lincoln," Purbright said. The word was not a guess. It had been supplied by the paper's watermark and by Mrs. Venn's own calculation. Yet when he said it, she released a breath that sounded like the end of a suture. "Lincoln," she agreed. "I wouldn't risk another Lincoln affair." She let the sentence down neatly upon the table between them and folded her hands upon it, as women once folded their gloves upon hymn books. The phrase had an almost official shape. It meant something. It had history inside it. The waiter arrived at this point with a tact so fine that it could be measured only by its success. He inquired whether tea would be welcome. Mrs. Venn seemed grateful to be asked a question with a correct answer. "Tea would be correct," she said. "Inspector?" "Correct," Purbright agreed. They took tea. It was decently hot and insufficiently strong, thereby satisfying the Swan's policy of finding acceptable endings for opposing wishes. The cups had hairline cracks that the staff had taught themselves not to see. A thing remains whole in some establishments until it admits otherwise. "Lincoln," Purbright said, when the waiter had retreated. "If it is not a wound, it would be helpful to know what shape it took." "It is not a wound," she said. "It is a bruise I do not show at dances." Her dry precision pleased him. He waited. "A gentleman," she said, "who introduced himself as a widower of resources and spoke as if he were balancing them in his head, became a friend of the theatre society. He expressed interest in the restoration of the hall, admired the committees, understood their doubts. He could discuss carpeting as though it were scholarship. He donated a set of green-shaded lamps for the reading room and a portrait no one had asked for. He was soon upon several lists. He borrowed nothing and requested nothing, which made him seem harmless. But he preferred to speak after meetings rather than before them, and in the course of those small conversations he suggested arrangements by which modest sums could be temporarily lodged with him to secure discounts from a supplier. She smiled without warmth. "It is always discounts. Good people are greedy for economies." "And did any good person grow poorer?" "Yes," she said. "Not publicly. The loss was spread thinly, and their pride even more thinly. It would have required a demonstration, and to stage a demonstration about money would have looked like ill temper. We learned to be ashamed privately." "And the gentleman?" "He left when spring made the roads more civil. The lamps remained. The portrait was rehung in a corridor." "A salutary redeployment," Purbright said. "You suspected our Flaxborough advertisement pointed to a man of the same usage." "I suspected," Mrs. Venn said, "that I might recognize the vocabulary. The first time is noise, the second is music." She took a card from her reticule, plain, unfashionable, and placed it next to the pink envelope. "If you meet him, Inspector, you may tell him that Mrs. Venn would not be attentive. He will not remember my name." but he will remember that I did not sign a form. Purbright looked down at the pink stationery again. The ink had been laid with commitment. The loops were careful. He noticed in the bottom left of the page a small indentation as from a pin pressed lightly, as girls once pressed flowers into books and then thought better of it. The perfume, now that it had mingled with coal smell and tea, had become less an odor than a posture. "I'm obliged," he said, rising. "You have given me what the newspaper did not. Shape." Mrs. Venn rose with him, not out of deference, but as one participates in a completed movement. "You will be kind enough to destroy my letter," she said. "I wrote it in a moment of what, to others, would seem rashness. To me it was the opposite." "I shall," Purbright said. She hesitated, then inclined her head. "If you tell him that you are acquainted with the Lincoln lamps, he will understand. The sort of man we mean keeps an inventory of his own benefactions." He offered his hand. She placed hers in it briefly, with the awkward grace of a person committed to forms. They parted without further agreement. He watched her cross the lobby and pause, just a moment, at the visitors' rack where cards for local attractions announced themselves. She regarded them and took none. Then she was gone, leaving behind that delicate sense one has after a conversation properly concluded, the absence of complaint. The hotel manager approached with a tact less fine than the waiter's, but more decorated. "Inspector," he said, "a pleasure as always. If you are to be with us for luncheon another day, it would assist my staff to be informed. We dislike to disappoint." "I shall undertake to disappoint as few as possible," Purbright said. His eyes, which had been content with chairs, now considered the arrangement upon the table. The pink envelope, Mrs. Venn's card, a notice, newly printed, set among the dessert wine recommendations, a small rectangle announcing "Private meeting rooms available. Discretion observed. Inquire at reception." The notice could have been months old, but the ink suggested otherwise. He asked conversationally whether the hotel had many requests for such rooms of late. "Fewer than we prefer, more than we discuss," the manager said, with a smile that had learned to appear spontaneously on mention of receipts. "The season brings its visitors." Outside, the afternoon had settled into its posture of getting on with it. Purbright walked back by mean streets that were not in moral disrepair, but enjoyed a good gossip. A notice about dog licenses had been pasted to a lamp post slightly skewed, as if authority had blinked at the wind and decided to compromise. A boy on a bicycle executed a grand turn at the corner of Baffin Terrace, looked pleased with himself, and observed the law by ringing his bell. At the station, Purbright placed Mrs. Venn's letter into an envelope addressed to himself and wrote upon it, "Destroy," after noting. He wrote not because the instruction was necessary, but because writing it would prevent him reading the letter again in idle moments. Temptation should be given paperwork. On the blotter lay the week's advertiser, folded to the relevant page. Box 24-7331- had earned a second insertion. The wording had not altered. It remained the same calm rectangle upon the page, like a mat placed to receive something valuable and small. At the bottom of the column, in the cramped moralizing style of the compositor, a note had been added. "All correspondents are advised to exercise prudence when responding to personal notices." The asterisk fluttered its virtue. Purbright turned the page and, as he did so, noticed a smear of very faint rose color along the margin that could only have come from his hand. The pink paper had been less fast than it looked. He looked at his fingers and found, in the whirl of his index, a match for the hue. The perfume remained, neither vulgar nor weak, like a principle held quietly. He sat a while, arranging the day's small truths into a drawer that did not yet require labels. A misdelivered letter had gone to its wrong police station. A lady had been glad of it. The Swan had acquired a new card about discretion. The hotel's fire, perennial, legitimate, careful, had warmed a conversation that, had it been held in a different room, might have become gossip. And Lincoln, placed on the table with such prim clarity, had acquired the gentle weight of precedent. Lamps, a portrait, small sums made shy by their owners. These were not crimes in Flaxborough, not immediately. They were arrangements, and arrangements were respectable, until someone declined an invitation. He rose to wash the rose trace from his finger. As he did so, he paused and then took the envelope again to the window. In the slanted light, a second watermark appeared, at 90 degrees to the first, ghostly but distinct. A tiny swan. Not from the stationer, then. From the hotel's own paper, reused as notepaper by someone with habits of thrift, or a wish to look as though she had them. Economies, he said softly, without irony. Then he set the envelope down and, for the first time, wondered whether 7,331 had supplied his own writing paper to others, or whether Mrs. Venn had borrowed hers from a room she did not, after all, intend to use. Miss Lucilla Teatime intercepted Inspector Purbright on the High Street with the unanswerable authority of a person carrying both a parasol and a conclusion. She had chosen, with tact or calculation, a point between the chemists and the tobacconists, neutral ground on which nothing improper could be said aloud without appearing to seek cure or indulgence. "Inspector," she announced, "you will take tea with me at once before the town drowns in unsubstantiated rumor and begins to swim." Purbright, who regarded refusals as useful chiefly when postponed, allowed himself to be conducted to the Temperance Cafe. This establishment preserved a decorum that had survived its signature coffee. Its tables were narrow, its teaspoons reproachful, and its counter populated by buns that stood like a jury, bound by oath not to be improved. Miss Teatime selected a corner that deterred eavesdroppers by offering them a too clear view. She removed her gloves as one might unmask a theatre prop that has served. The new hat, Gedge's handiwork, sat at an angle of intention rather than accident. "2 lapsangs," she told the waitress, "and a slice of something that pretends to be lemon." The waitress complied, respectful of Miss Teatime's habit of patronage. When the tea arrived, Miss Teatime poured with a precision that made the act seem like a statement. She placed a cup before Purbright and folded her hands in the manner of a witness at liberty. "You are aware," she began, "that our advertiser has permitted a personal notice of a particularly municipal kind." "It has that reputation," Purbright admitted. "A numbered entreaty," she went on, couched in that perverse tone of duty which is always so appealing to persons who have mislaid their own. "Mutual respect in matters domestic." The phrase is practically a floor cloth. "Some floors," Purbright said, "require cloths." She regarded him kindly. "Inspector, when romance proposes to be respectable, one must look to the cash box. There is a syndicate, small, sober, and thoroughly modern, arranging companionship for those who are lonely and those who are solvent. It is my sorrow to inform you that the two constituencies overlap to a degree that upsets arithmetic." "Companionship," Purbright repeated. "Not matrimony?" "Goodness, no. Matrimony insists upon a register and a cake. Companionship requires only furniture and a calendar." She sipped. The scheme is simplicity itself. A gentleman, rarely handsome, invariably punctual, presents himself as the answer to a question people are too polite to ask aloud. He meets ladies of a certain age at the Swan or at flats that dignify themselves with names. He speaks of mutuality, discretion, economies of housekeeping, always economies. In due course, arrangements arise that are not quite agreements, a shared account for domestic purchases, a loan to secure a discount from a supplier, a gentle pooling of bills. Nothing that would embarrass a magistrate, everything that would discompose a church flower committee. "It sounds," Purbright said, "like a contract whose terms are sighs." "It is rather worse," Miss Teatime said with relish contained. "It is a business plan with manners. The participants are carefully chosen. A widow whose relatives are far enough away to be grateful. A spinster with a reputation for good sense. A retired secretary who keeps vouchers as if they were testimonials. The gentleman is appropriately widowed naturally. He owns a jacket that prefers October. He pays in cash, and he signs in books with a hand that hesitates only at consonants. Purbright let the list organize itself. And the profits accrue. Where? To the centre, she said crisply. There is always a centre. Our gentleman is the emissary. Behind him one finds a small company of men, 2, perhaps 3, practiced at modest extraction. They have an address that is never empty and a telephone number that rings to a decision. The law would inquire whether theft has occurred and be told no, only arrangements and disappointments. Such disappointments are not crimes in Flaxborough. They are correspondence. Your knowledge, Purbright observed, honours particulars. Miss Teatime placed her cup upon its saucer with ceremony. It is a habit of mine to acquire particulars in self-defence. Against suitors? He asked, mild as a cloud. Against boredom, she replied. Boredom leads to causes. Causes lead to meetings, meetings to minutes, and minutes attract men with economies. There is no more dangerous creature than a gentleman with a calculator and a moral tone. The temperance bell obliged the entrance of a new customer. The bell's anxiety was perpetual, and thus ignored. Outside, High Street rearranged itself. A pram briefly blocked a postman's progress. An elderly cyclist negotiated virtue at the crossing. "And what," Purbright said, "do you intend me to do with your particulars?" "Whatever preserves our illusion of decency," Miss Teatime said pleasantly. "If you arrest anyone, we shall be obliged to know why. If you do nothing, the Guild will write a paragraph about the decline of standards, and I shall be bored." She smiled across the rim of her cup, not coquettish, but amused at her own fairness. Purbright, who disliked being obliged to comment upon fairness, adjusted the spoon on his saucer and left it at an angle that offended no one. "The Swan," he said, "has lately discovered the virtues of small private rooms." "Discretion is always an innovation," Miss Teatime said. "It goes out of fashion every Lent and returns for the fete." She selected the lemon cake with a neat fork and revised it into evidence. "Our gentleman," she continued, "inspects furnished flats not, as he would like us to believe, for the comfort of future fireside chats, but to ensure that an occupant may be moved with dignity from one room to another. Liquidity, Inspector. When one disappoints several people modestly, it is prudent to be able to change one's address without introducing the police to one's day." "Have you met him?" Purbright asked. Miss Teatime's pause was brief and readable. "I've met his type," she said. "The type that makes women self-conscious about their furniture and men self-conscious about their policy." "Your type is not easily made self-conscious," Purbright said. "Only by hats," she conceded. "And on that subject, you must not mistake my interest for involvement. I have not replied to numbers in any newspaper since since newspapers were different. I prefer names. They are more culpable." Purbright recognized with professional gratitude the careful omission. She had outlined a landscape while not identifying a window. He regarded the cafe's small clock, which had been persuaded to keep time by argument rather than mechanism. Sergeant Malley, dutifully elsewhere, would by now have visited a property agent and discovered an enthusiasm for thin curtains. The Guild secretary, surrounded by green vases, would have drafted a paragraph praising patience in adversity, thereby exciting the impatience it deplored. In this orchestration, Miss Teatime's melody was a motif, crisp, amoral, and tuned to gossip. "The magistrates," Purbright said, "enjoy costs where there are offences. You propose difficulties where there are none. I propose," Miss Teatime said, "that the town will not bear scandal unless it can be distributed. Your gift, Inspector, is to make matters appear smaller and therefore manageable. Please do not spoil your reputation." She pushed the lemon cake toward him in a gesture that could be called generous only by those who prized appearances over cake. He declined with thanks. The lemon continued to pretend. "It is also my gift," he said, "to prefer evidence to adjectives." "How dreary for you," she murmured. "Very well, evidence. The Companionship Syndicate uses brochures designed to look like church circulars. Pale paper, sober type, the word mutual repeated through synonyms until it resembles virtue. There is a Lincoln Stationer's watermark on some. Chapelle and Grieve. It travels well. The men prefer evening appointments and rooms with chains. They have a weakness for aspidistras. Continuity, you know. One of them writes his zero with a diagonal, which is foreign or simply affected. It hardly matters which, and there is a habit of testifying to one's discretion by speaking softly about the indiscretions of others. I detest softness for that purpose. Purbright, whose notebook remained where it always did, absent, felt no need to memorialize. The details, while sufficient for gossip, were not yet adequate for court. He let them sort themselves into the drawers of his mind, which closed without labels until labels became unavoidable. "You have been very helpful," he said. Miss Teatime eyed him. "You are very disbelieving. It is charming when worn lightly." "It saves disappointment," he said. "Disappointment," she replied, "is rarely saved. It is invested at poor interest and returns as prudence." She replaced her gloves with a deliberation that suggested either dignity or armor. Her handbag, glossy, compact, prepared, accepted what it always had. A handkerchief that had never been used in public, a pencil that drew only on other people's paper, and a small purse in which coins lay as if they were recovering from something. "The Ladies' Guild," she observed, "will be sending a second appeal for vases. They wish to avoid scandal by making it symmetrical. Everyone invited to contribute. No one singled out for blame. It is a sound method for flowers, less sound for men." "You are not on the guild committee," Purbright said. "Being on committees," she said with politeness, "encourages a belief that one is large enough to be blamed. I cultivate smaller illusions." The bill arrived, as it always did when conversation had reached a point at which money would look like a relief. Miss Teatime glanced at it and produced the exact amount with a quick, trim count. Her coins did not clink. They arrived. She placed them upon the saucer and laid a sixpence beside them with the air of a person investing in the continued existence of waitresses. As she reached for her handbag, the fine seam at the base of her right glove caught momentarily upon the edge of the teacup's handle. She did not tug, she eased. A thread, pale gray and slender as an excuse, unwound itself half an inch before she stroked it back into line with a fingertip. Purbright, who had taught himself the art of not watching, did not watch. He was remembering, without effort, the single thread that had clung to the back of an envelope at the advertiser office, the one addressed to Box 24, which had seemed the business of a glove, or of twine, or of caution. He had left it where it was, decent and useless. He left this one as well, content to let parallels be content with themselves. They rose. Outside, the air had the polite damp of an afternoon considering rain. The chemist's window was arranged in graduating greens, the tobacconist's in browns that wished to be called mahogany. Miss Teatime adjusted her hat a degree. The degree suggested she had been right all along. "Certain arrangements," she said lightly, "can be profitable, provided one knows when to step away. I've always had an admirable sense of timing." "I shall note that," Purbright said. She looked up at him with tolerant amusement. "You will note nothing. You will file a suspicion in a drawer where it can ripen without encouragement. Then you will open it when the town is ready to call propriety by another name." "That is a crowded drawer," he said. "I hope," she replied. "It is well made." She moved off with that compact efficiency that makes small women appear to be leaving rooms tidier than they found them. The bell at the cafe door performed its minor hysterics. She did not look back, which is the most articulate way of saying that one has nothing to hide in the length of the street. Purbright stood a moment longer, less to think than to allow thinking to appear unnecessary. He turned then toward the station, where forms continued to request signatures, and signatures continued to require forms. On the way, he passed the advertiser office. The bell there trembled, hopeful and unmusical. Through the window he could see Miss Fallow placing a small notice into the metal rack. Personal. Renewal received. Box 24. The slip of paper had a faint blush, as if it had been stored near a more confident color. He walked on, and the town resumed its preferred occupations, mistrusting, approving, arranging, and calling both prudence. Somewhere, perhaps at Roseley or Pantile Court, a man considered curtains. Somewhere else, in a drawer that closed quietly, a thread waited for its moment to be called evidence. The parish council met in a schoolroom whose paint had been chosen to resist both chalk and ambition. A clock set high above the blackboard kept time in the benevolent way of institutions. It forgave lapses provided they were shared. The chairman, Councillor Bracknell, occupied the teacher's desk with the air of a gentleman who had outlived corporal punishment but retained sympathy for it. The parish clerk, Mr. Hames, arranged his minutes book, sharpened his pencil to the fineness of a rebuke, and wrote the date with a care that suggested the month might complain if slighted. Inspector Purbright had installed himself upon one of the small chairs at the back, where the knees of childhood had left their polished ghosts. He was present, if asked, to hear a matter touching licensing and public convenience. But in truth, he was there to listen to how people avoided saying what they meant. Flaxborough's public life was a succession of such exercises. The town prided itself on never having been vulgar enough to be clear. Councillor Bracknell rapped the desk with a pencil that had been promoted to gavel. "Gentlemen, ladies, if we might begin. Item 1. Approval of the minutes." A rustle like a small wind passed over the tables as members pretended to read what they already intended to approve. Item 2. Drainage at the lower close. We have received representations alleging that during heavy rainwater is inconsiderate. Mr. Hames? The clerk, a man who liked water best in ink, rose part way and sat again. "Correspondence has been received," he said, "to the effect that the culvert behind Fen Lane fails to convey at its previous rate." "Culverts?" sighed Mrs. Lynde, who came as the guild's emissary and conscience, "so often fail to convey." "Quite," said Bracknell. "We shall inspect. Meanwhile, item 3. Any other business germane to drainage." It was at this point that the Swan Hotel entered the room by way of a cough. Councillor Petty, who represented local commerce and owned a van that believed itself to be a fleet, cleared his throat with an innocence that might have passed for weather. "Mr. Chairman, if it be admissible, I wonder whether the council would care to note that establishments offering private rooms are an increasing drain on parking." There was a pause, then the small laugh that accompanies something not yet decided to be funny. Mrs. Lynde, who disliked laughter she had not requisitioned, arranged her face to disapprove of parking generally. "We have not," Bracknell said, "on tonight's agenda the question of private rooms. We are concerned with water." "Quite so," Petty agreed. "Only it has been mentioned to me that water is not the only thing that wishes to be conveyed away discreetly." The clerk pretended to write something. The clock admonished 7:42 and then forgave it. 2. Councillors achieved a complicated avoidance of one another's gaze which, if diagrammed, would have resembled a new form of gymnastics. Purbright, from his modest seat, watched the choreography. The fleeting glance that checks whether an ally has decided. The frown that rehearses sympathy in case it becomes necessary. The hand placed upon the minute book with proprietary gentleness. The words "Swan Hotel Matter" passed along the table like a biscuit no one wished to take first. "We do not," said Bracknell, "repeat hearsay in this room." If there is a grievance, it shall be written down and, if necessary, referred to the appropriate committee. Mrs. Lynde, scenting an opportunity to deplore, leaned forward. There is, it must be said, a concern among ladies of the parish. Flowers have suffered. Standards, by which I mean arrangements, have been pressured by distractions. The drains, Bracknell said, rescued by topography, remain our subject. The culvert behind Fen Lane. Hames, pray continue. The clerk lifted his pencil with the slow gravity of a man asked to resume after a hymn. The culvert, sir, he said, is narrow and partly of brick of an age to excite regret. I have received a request, informal, that access to the back ditch behind Larksmead Cottage be improved. The cottage lies at the outer end of Fen Lane. A tenant? Asked Bracknell, wary of new people as an old dog is wary of strange umbrellas. Yes, Hames said. One Sallows, Mr. Elwyn. He has inquired concerning refuse days and made suggestions as to the angle of the grid. What sort of suggestions? Asked Mrs. Lynde, suspicious in principle of angles. That the grid might be turned a degree, said Hames, to discourage puddling at the threshold. There was a murmur of appreciation. Grids that discouraged puddling were thought virtuous. Petty coughed again. I'm acquainted with the cottage, Chairman, a solid little place with the modern improvement of curtains that do not rely solely on daylight. The new tenant is particular. He pays in cash. The word cash in the parish's mouth had the texture of something one would not object to being given but disliked seeing exchanged. Bracknell put down his pencil in order to be seen putting it down. Cash is lawful, he said, as one might remind people that cats belong to nature. Lawful, Petty agreed, like water. Let us then, said the chairman, return to water. They did not immediately. A councillor from the outlying farms wished to mention the Swan again in tones of rural grievance, and was permitted to do so briefly. The parish clerk recorded none of this, but allowed his pencil to hover in the way that lets people think they have been entered into history. At length, the meeting recollected itself and proceeded. A notice about the autumn fete was read and admired. A motion to thank Mrs. Darbury for her years with the flowers passed without needing to know where she was. Then Hames, who had husbanded a small item like a man reluctant to spend, cleared his throat in the minor key of announcement. An anonymous donation has been received for the reading room, he said. 2 green-shaded lamps. The donor suggests their use to assist reading after meetings. There was a soft enthusiasm. Green-shaded lamps belonged to the excellent tradition of creditable improvements that thrilled no one and yet impressed everyone. Mrs. Lynde said that evening light improved the moral tone. Petty, who preferred things that could be sold, murmured doubly. Purbright, who let words discover their neighbours before believing them, considered the phrase after meetings. It had the same air as evenings preferred, softened by philanthropy. Bracknell, relieved to offer thanks without particulars, proposed that the council express gratitude and entrust the positioning to taste. The motion passed. The clock, which had adopted the meeting, marked 8:07 with a sound that allowed people to remember their suppers. As the assembly disbanded, files gathered, nods performed, the first agreeable lies about future attendance exchanged, Purbright remained seated until the last greeting had lost its echo. He rose then and drifted forward, in no hurry to catch Mr. Hames, but certain he would be caught. Good evening, clerk. A well-managed reign of topics. Hames accepted the compliment as one might accept a wafer. We must keep the roof on, Inspector. It is my trade to nail down what blows into a meeting. The culvert at Fen Lane, Purbright said. Who wrote of it? Not written, sir. Mentioned, standing by my desk. The new gentleman at Larksmead Cottage. He held his hat with care. Some hats are held as if they were hired. His was not. Particular, said Purbright, and paying in cash. The clerk managed a neutral syllable that could be taken to approve either method or result. He also remarked, Hames added, that should the council require a small donation toward materials, he might be prevailed upon to assist. An admirer of efficiency, he said. Admirers of efficiency, Purbright answered, are not to be despised. Does he attend meetings? Not this evening. He asked, casually, at what time the council usually dispersed. I told him we aimed for 9 and struck 8 when possible. Purbright allowed himself a small look at the minutes book, which lay open, receiving its last benediction of blotting paper. The rounded 8s, the modest loops, nothing slashed, nothing foreign. Only a careful hand recording that the council had been grateful for lamps and in favor of dryness. Thank you, he said, as a man thanks a barometer. Outside, the schoolyard made an effort at gravel. Lamps prepared themselves for usefulness. Purbright walked toward the station, feeling the shape of the evening begin to form around his day. At his desk, a memorandum waited in Sergeant Malley's hand, neat, moderately square, and innocent of flourishes. Larksmead Cottage, Malley reported, entering as Purbright lifted the page, is now occupied. Owner Mrs. Goosey, widowed twice, not recently, lets it furnished when she does not require solitude. Mr. Elwyn Sallows agreed terms yesterday at 5. Cash. Asked that deliveries be made to back gate to avoid disturbing front. Keys in possession of tenant since last night. He has slept there in the sense that the bed has been turned down. Milk left this morning was found as left. Coal he requested for the scuttle has not yet been burned. Curtains newly hung. Chain upon front door oiled. Aspidistra present, thriving. And Mr. Sallows himself? Seen there for half an hour at noon. Arrived on foot carrying the advertiser. Departed with nothing and with boots that, by the evidence of Mrs. Goosey's threshold, retained no mud. Also asked Mrs. Goosey if the ditch at the back ever overperformed. She did not understand and said no, because it seemed expected. Purbright looked up. Overperformed? Yes, sir. His tone was collegial. He admired the cottage's privacy and inquired whether the dustman ever visited in the afternoon. He prefers a morning removal. Who does not? Purbright said, not expecting reply. Malley produced, with a small satisfaction, a receipt. Mrs. Goosey wished it known she keeps a book. She requested a signature. Mr. Sallows obliged, E. Sallow, then corrected to Sallows by adding an upright with a stroke of regret. The figure 0 in the amount, £2 for the week, has been adorned with a diagonal. She discouraged ornament, but made no scene. Purbright took the book and saw the neat apology of the added consonant. The diagonal through the 0 cut the rounded line as if to prevent its returning to itself. A small habit with large intentions. He returned the book and sat with his hands resting upon the blotter, empty of letters now and smelling faintly of the council's violets and gas. Did he give a telephone? None. Evenings preferred, verbally but not on a card. He admired the aspidistra and said it signified continuity. A word making itself useful, Purbright murmured. He rose and walked to the wall map of the parish that he kept not as decoration, but as a chart of how people avoided each other. Fen Lane ran like a thought one intends to keep to oneself, finishing in a small kink where Larksmead Cottage sat behind a hedge that believed in privacy. Behind it, the ditch went its way, dutiful and obscure, making under the hedge a convenient promise to carry things away. In Flaxborough, cash purchases were less about convenience than about concealment, and concealment, properly managed, was a species of good manners. The parish had received lamps, covered its drains with gratitude, and hinted at the Swan with just enough tact to make scolding possible. A tenant had chosen a cottage, paid with decorum, turned a bed without resting in it, and asked that the grid be turned a degree to keep puddles from the threshold. An admirable concern for thresholds, Purbright said aloud to the map. It made no objection. He returned to his desk, where the advertiser, unfolded by the hand of habit, lay open at the personals. 7,331 still proposed mutual respect as if it had been discovered in a cupboard. At the foot of the column, the compositor had indulged his conscience again. Correspondents are reminded that the advertiser accepts no responsibility for private arrangements. The sentence made the right kind of music for a town that loved propriety and practiced compromise. He drew the parish minutes toward him, not to annotate, but to sit with their tone. Near the end, in the clerk's careful hand, was the entry accepting with thanks 2 green-shaded lamps for the reading room to assist reading after meetings. The donors to such things were generally men who enjoyed being seen by their kindness and invisible by their name. It did not surprise him, therefore, to find, tucked next to the minute, a small folded slip that Mr. Hames had, perhaps by force of habit, used as a place marker. It was a request form for the school's committee room, blank save for an imprint where a pen had rested too long. When he held it to the light, a ghost of letters appeared, pressed from the page above. After meeting, 8 to 9, preferred. Purbright let the slip return to the book as quietly as it had come. He washed his hands, for form's sake, and stood for a time at the window, looking toward the town that liked to keep its rain and its rumors moving properly. Then he sat again, not to write, and permitted himself the indulgence of a small, unrecorded question, whether the gentleman who worried over puddles at thresholds had chosen his cottage for the back ditch, or his arrangements for the hours when council lamps would be lit and eyes decently lowered to minutes. The news of Mrs. Darbury's removal to Bournemouth travelled through Flaxborough as respectably as a funeral, and rather more briskly. It began with the guild treasurer, who arrived at the vicarage in a condition of gentle alarm, bearing a note whose haste had not prevented it from being reproachful. "Inspector," she told Purbright, whom the rector had invited in to admire a theological calendar while being told other things, "I would not complain if matters were clear, but when people say rest cure, they should not leave subscriptions unpacified." The note, which the treasurer relinquished as one might hand over a cat with opinions, comprised 3 sentences on a thin page inclined to transparency. "Circumstances oblige a short absence. Please forgive any outstanding matters. Arrangements are in hand." Bournemouth concluded it, standing alone like a password. "Arrangements," the treasurer repeated as though testing whether the word improved with use. "It will not have escaped you that the Ladies' Guild is not improved by arrangements when the arranging person has retired from the room." Purbright agreed that improvement was elusive in the absence of the improver. He refolded the note along its original crease. Even paper preferred old habits. By noon the same day, Sergeant Malley, acting on instructions that had not insisted upon speed, brought the station gossip. "The porter at the Midland reports a trunk," he said. "Large, leather, with a strap that believed in the future. Dispatched this morning, carriage forward. Sender gave no name. The ticket reads only Beemth, West Cliff." The clerk weighed it at 40. Then, noticing difficulty, amended to 30, striking the 0 with a diagonal as if saving the scale's embarrassment. Purbright, who found human character more legible on weights than on speeches, grunted without scorn. "Who carried the trunk?" "Delivered by cab," Malley said. "Hailing point near Rosalie Mansions." The cabman admired the strap's obstinacy and refused to discuss passengers on the grounds that passengers become vindictive when named. "Did the strap leave any of itself behind?" Malley allowed himself a half-smile. "A thread, grey and well brought up, found on the porter's jacket afterwards. He thought it twine. It looked like the offspring of a glove." Purbright did not ask him to bring the thread. Threads were more useful where they were, suggested rather than collected. He put the trunk and Mrs. Darbury's Bournemouth side by side in his head and did not permit them to become an equation. When 2 items insist upon being added, it is often instructive to multiply silence. Resist the trunk for the present, he said. Let us look instead for the sort of living that can be done without employment. He let the wording rest. Withdrawals. Quiet ones. See whether the district's banks have noticed a tide that changes on particular moons. Malley, who had the excellent habit of not requiring his metaphors diluted, nodded and went out. The afternoon lengthened without drama, which is how afternoons prefer it. The town's respectable industry, letters, receipts, the preparation of tea, proceeded with minor jolts toward 4 o'clock. Miss Teatime passed the station window, paid her reflection a small compliment, and did not look in. The advertiser bell twitched anxiously at shadows. By evening, Malley had coaxed preliminary murmurs from 2 bank managers and a building society whose clerk distrusted both ink and inquiry. It will take time, he said, setting his notes where they would not be seen by anyone who claimed to have only admired them. They require forms, explaining that we are not hunting riots. Let them enjoy their forms, Purbright said amiably. Riot is best sought in minutes and subscriptions. The next day produced the Guild's second communication in as many weeks, an appeal printed in a typeface that accepted moral purpose badly, for patience during temporary transitions. That phrase joined arrangements in hand on the inspector's small shelf reserved for comfort, intended to be public. Meanwhile, the station learned something new about Bournemouth. A card arrived at the vicarage with a view of the peer whose melancholy had not survived reproduction. On the back, in a script that hovered between decisiveness and imitation, Mrs. Darbury assured the treasurer that she was benefiting and had found facilities adequate to needs. She sent love to the rector's wife and regards as appropriate to the committee. It was a kind letter, if one admired kindness exercised by dispatch. Malley returned in the afternoon with a packet of arithmetic. The district bank's remark, when invited, that certain of their clients, women of comfortable habit, have withdrawn modest sums at regular intervals these past months, he said. £2 here, 3 there, rarely 5. Never on the same day of the week long enough to be noticed by a cashier whose talent is routine. The passbooks call it cash. The tellers call it household. How many households? Asked Purbright. Concur. 6 that we can name without hypothesis, Malley said, and 2 more that frown usefully when asked. The amounts are personable. Each by itself is entirely too moral to attract complaint. But if one were to imagine them all replying to the same advertisement, one might begin to suspect concert. A quiet symphony, Purbright said. He glanced at the figures, columns modest as curtains, and let his eye find a rhythm. A second Tuesday here, a late Friday there, the slight seasonal bulge of lending oneself a better Christmas. Any coincidence with meetings in the reading room? Twice, Malley said. The dates match evenings when the new green lamps would have made thinking after 9 a courtesy rather than a penalty. I mention it only because coincidence is a beast that likes to be patted in public before biting in private. The lamps are receiving more gratitude than they can hold, Purbright observed. We shall not add ours. They visited, with permission and tea, 2 of the ladies whose passbooks had been coaxed toward daylight. Each explained her withdrawals with the ease of those who speak truthfully about the wrong thing. One had advanced a supplier a token to secure a quantity price, a phrase whose calm troubled her more than the sum. Another had reimbursed a gentleman for incidentals incurred on my behalf, as if incidentals were a hobby. Both produced receipts of the sort that preferred to be shown rather than studied. Small, not quite identical, bearing a name that did not insist upon itself. E. Sallow on one, E. Sallows on the other, and the carefully disfigured 0. Neither lady appeared, cheated. Each appeared slightly improved by her own secrecy, which is a satisfaction no court will remove. Has your gentleman gone away? Purbright asked, as though inquiring after a gardener. "We do not speak of his comings and goings," said the first, and from this one might deduce that conversation had been frequent. The second tittered, not at the implication, but at her own modesty. "He is not a gentleman one inconveniences with timetables," she said. "He is punctual without being dull. It is a distinction." Outside, Mally observed that distinctions of that kind turn up in advertisements written by those who dislike the visible world. Purbright commended the line to memory for a later occasion when it could be mistaken for his. At the railway, the porter, Mr. Rudge, a man whose life had taught him that luggage labels contain more fiction than novels, recalled the trunk. "A smart brown," he said. "Took the ropes like a soldier. Gentlemen brought it, two of them in the sense that one held the handle while the other held the conversation. They said Westcliff with the disgust of people unwilling to pronounce vowels in public. I wrote the ticket. Fellow leaned in kindly and improved my 0. "Corrected?" Purbright asked. "Improved," said Rudge. "You noticed how clear them foreigners keep their noughts?" He liked that. I do not refuse instruction. I observed also that he paid nothing and smiled, which is a system. "Was it heavy at 30? Mally asked. "Full enough to consult itself," Rudge said, "but not so full as to require a second man to pretend it was heavier. I've known trunks undertake the journey lighter by hope than by rail." Purbright thanked him and permitted the trunk to remain an object bound to be somewhere else. Back at the station, a bank manager, Mr. Leeds of the Savings, a man who wore caution as other men wore cufflinks, accepted a visit. His office had improved its authority with brass corners and a photograph of local cricket. "You understand," he said, "that discretion is the bank's heaviest coin." "I should be sorry to exchange it," said Purbright. "I need only small change." Leeds sighed, which in banking is a minor currency. "There have been withdrawals," he admitted, steady in their modesty. "Several widows, if we may use that category without trespass, have found reason to require a little cash once a week. Some of them, not all, prefer the afternoon after 2, an hour pleasing to no one but chosen by many." "Chosen," Purbright repeated. "By suggestion, perhaps." Leeds pretended not to have heard and produced, instead, a binder of passbook copies whose economies gave them a family resemblance. In one, beside a line of 4 successive 3s, a faint indentation suggested that a pen had paused to consider whether to add a flourish to a surname that did not belong to the owner of the book. In another, a teller's initials had been simplified to M on a day Mally recalled attending the counter. "Who brings them?" Purbright asked quietly. "The owners," Leeds said. "We do not issue money to ghosts. Occasionally a nephew waits outside, or someone who prefers the doorway. There has been, I will confess, a voice, pleasing, exact, heard to explain to a reluctant lady that household cash is best kept visible because it discourages suspicion. The phrase discourages suspicion has taken residence in our lobby." Leeds closed the binder with relief. "We are a bank, Inspector. We do not offer morals." "It would be uncompetitive," Purbright agreed. They returned to the station under a sky that examined its own conscience and decided on drizzle. In the corridor, Miss Fallow of the Advertiser, who had come to deliver a correction about dog licenses, paused to sympathize with the weather. "One tries to be optimistic," she said, "but the week improves only on paper." "Paper does what it can," Purbright said, and accepted a small bundle of notices. Among them lay an envelope, redirected from the Advertiser to the station by a postman who believed in favoring the person most likely to be amused. The envelope, once pink, had lost confidence in itself. Across its corner, a slight grey smudge appeared, where it had brushed against something more practical. "More perfume?" Mally asked, with the neutrality of a man noticing possibilities. "No," Purbright said, sniffing indifferently. "Travel." He sat and allowed the week's arithmetic to compose itself on his blotter. A rest cure in Bournemouth, a trunk whose weight had briefly aspired, a set of green lamps, modest sums departing with moral titles, and a cottage whose aspidistra had been praised into significance. What bound them was not proof. Flaxborough disliked proof and considered it unkind, but rhythm. And rhythm, once heard, is difficult to ignore even when the dance is discreet. He reached for Mrs. Darby's note again and held it under the lamp. In the phrase arrangements are in hand, the second word cleared its throat. The pen had pressed harder on hand, as if anxious to assure the treasurer that hands existed. The paper's watermark, faint until tilted, offered dignity in the form of a Lincoln stationer, identical to the one on Mrs. Venn's pink letter, but now served in white. People chose paper with more care than they chose men. He replaced the note and, for no good administrative reason, drew from a drawer the left luggage docket copied for him by Rudge with a pride that bordered upon disloyalty. Bempth, West Cliff, it read, with the 0 slashed and the figure 3 formed like an afterthought to a 2 that had considered itself. On the back, by habit or vanity, someone, porter or sender, had stroked the strap's end and left upon the card a faint line of grey. It looked very like the thread that had clung to the advertiser's envelope, or like any other thread, if one preferred to be just. He put the docket away. "Shall I speak with the guild treasurer again?" Mally asked from the doorway, not eager, merely prepared. "Give her our respect," said Purbright. "Ask whether receipts have become letters, and if she volunteers an improvement, accept it with thanks." When Mally had gone, the inspector sat a moment longer, not thinking but allowing the town to move around inside his head as it did outside, quietly, with a certain parochial grace, and inclined to tidy itself in the presence of others. Then he took up his hat, stood, and paused with his hand on the light switch. At the far edge of the blotter lay a list Mally had left without emphasis, the dates and amounts of the widow's withdrawals, copied in his small, precise hand. The last line, entered that morning, showed a new withdrawal, £2.06 from Mrs. Darby's account, counterfoil initialed by a clerk with neat care, time of day added by habit, 2:15 p.m. The date was today. The transaction had been made, the manager assured, on her instruction, a phrase wonderfully accommodating of distance. Purbright looked at the figure and let it settle. £2.06. Too much for a stamp, too little for a ticket. He turned off the light and locked the door, asking no more of the question than that it accompany him home, whether Bournemouth, like mutual respect, was one of those places to which decent people travel in order not to be seen where they are. Mrs. Venn returned to Flaxborough like weather, not announced, scarcely resisted, faintly reforming the light. She appeared at the station door one forenoon when the town, having decided upon a pale day, was getting on with it. Her hat belonged to a shop that did not insist. Her gloves had taken decisions on their own. The duty constable, who knew the difference between interruption and necessity, conducted her to Inspector Purbright with the care due to documents. "I understood," she said, when they were seated across the small table in his room, "that your gentleman has adopted your town." "We have a number of gentlemen," Purbright replied. "In what capacity has this one been adopted?" "In the way such men prefer," she said, "without christening and with every expectation of thanksgiving." He did not hurry her. Mrs. Venn arranged her handbag, the modest square that had previously carried no melodrama, and looked down at it as though it might submit a correction. Then she raised her eyes with that practiced composure of people who, having avoided scandal, are prepared to lend its outline to others. "I am not here to accuse," she began. "For the excellent reason that I have nothing to accuse with, I am here to describe. The person you have, Mr. Sallows, if you will accept the name, came to Lincoln before spring had quite remembered itself. He was plausibly widowed. He did not perform bereavement. He took rooms that, looked out upon a street with superior pretensions, and joined himself to committees the way ivy joins itself to suggestions. He enjoyed the phrase mutual advantage and allowed it to appear in the air near him. One learned to associate it with tidiness. "Tidiness is popular," Purbright observed. "Very," she said. "He offered it to us wholesale." The duty constable, returning with tea and an apology for its weakness, was thanked as though he had provided comfort rather than liquid. Mrs. Venn lifted her cup in both hands, the gesture of someone who has learned to pour warmth into itself, and went on. "There was a tea room." She said it without aspiration. "We had one, or rather the idea of one, in a side street near the market. The building was a draper's widow that required affection and varnish. Mr. Sallows admired it in the tone of people who praise other people's children to emphasize their own restraint. He suggested, gently, conversationally, that a small subscription would secure the lease and permit certain advantages. Carpets purchased in quantity, crockery at discount, a reliable supplier of cakes who respected economies. She glanced at the weak tea, which did not respect economies and had forgotten itself entirely. He was very free with the phrase joint venture and very careful with signatures. One gave him a small sum. Not for profit, understand, but for the pleasure of being reassured about one's taste. He produced receipts that seemed to belong more to respectability than to arithmetic. The venture had a name, the Robin and Quince. It was printed upon a piece of pale paper that, like all things printed upon pale paper, was impossible to contradict. "Who gave how much?" Purbright asked mildly. "Those who could," she said. "One lady gave £5 in a mood of being useful. Another gave 30 shillings in a mood of being included. I, being prone to moods only under supervision, gave £2 and 10. It is a sum difficult to describe to a husband even when one possesses one. I possess a memory instead. You perceive the advantage." "The tea room did not arrive," Purbright suggested, not unkindly. "It did not," Mrs. Venn agreed. "Workers never appeared. Only men who measured and approved without commitment. The lease was always to be signed tomorrow by a solicitor who preferred to be anonymous for reasons of economy. We were informed that a supplier required a deposit to secure crockery of a pattern that looked contented in the hand. We were assured that profit was vulgar and that satisfaction ought to be sufficient. When some of us began to suspect that satisfaction was being rationed, Mr. Sallows discovered an aunt who had been unwell for years, but had chosen that particular week to become more so. He left. A letter followed. The letter suggested that the market had become uncertain and that prudence must prevail. The letter admired our civic spirit and regretted its own inability to endure. The regret was printed upon the same pale paper. "Was there effort to recover the sums?" asked Purbright. "There were efforts to recover dignity," she said. "It was decided by those who decide such things that any other effort would look like temper. The tea room's name was spoken for a fortnight and then placed in a drawer with letters about the choir." She drank. The tea commended her restraint by not making matters worse. "One item remains," she added. "It is small. The reading room at the Mechanics' Institute had lately been improved by a gift of 2 green-shaded lamps. They were admired. They altered the room's character toward study and away from argument. They came, if one believes the card, from a friend of reading. The card's hand was like Mr. Sallows's, with the same certainty when issuing a diagonal to a 0. I do not accuse him of the gift. I merely remark that he was seen to sit beneath the lamps with satisfaction on evenings when committees had become regretful. Purbright's eyes, which preferred to notice furniture before they noticed feelings, did not look at the green lamps in his own mind. Not at once. He accepted the remark about the diagonal as one accepts a test in which one is confident of the answer and then resists the confidence. "You did not prosecute. You do not prosecute disappointment," she said. "You sought it. You move it from public to private life and arrange flowers in front of it. There was a sentiment, strong, polite, against any proceeding that might convert small bad judgment into large bad news. We had not been robbed, we had been modern. She set down her cup and regarded its pale contents with disapproval that would not trouble the parish. I have spoken more than I intended. You will, I hope, forgive a person who dislikes being useful. You are not useful, Purbright said. You are descriptive. We value description. It saves time later. What do you propose to do with description? She asked. Very little, he said. Perhaps arrange it in a drawer where it will meet other pieces and decide what they are. That is the difference, she remarked, fastening her handbag with a click that sounded judicial. In Lincoln, we put things away so that they need not meet. In your town, I suspect things contrive their own introductions. She rose, and he stood with the absent politeness of a man used to moving between chairs and doors. One detail, she added at the threshold as though presenting a calling card upon departure. He liked to use the word continuity where others say habit. He praised an aspidistra for embodying it. Plants are not easily flattered, Inspector, but the people who place them are. When she had gone, the weak tea acquired the virtue of being neglected. Purbright permitted himself the small liberty of looking at the town as if his window were a camera. The high street performed respectably. Pedestrians endured their purchases. A boy practiced the minor sin of ringing his bell without need. At the corner by the post office, Miss Teatime held a conversation with the fickle air and then left it for someone else. He considered then the lamps in the reading room, the ones donated without signature to assist reading after meetings. He pictured their green shades laying proper pools upon paper and the faces leaning into those pools. Parish councillors pleased with themselves, a guild secretary calculating sympathy, a gentleman who preferred evenings. He thought of the honest convenience of the cottage at the edge of town, with its chain oiled and its ditch willing to convey. Of a trunk whose strap left a grey confession on a railway card. Of small rule-bound withdrawals that, added to one another, became a method. He allowed himself a visit to the Swan by way of memory. When one stands in certain lounges at 4 in the afternoon, the carpet seems to have discovered manners independent of the people upon it. The little notice offering private rooms, discretion observed, had not removed itself. Managers liked recurrences that could be trusted. And Mrs. Venn's phrase, "I wouldn't risk another Lincoln affair," had taken up residence like a guest in a hotel that did not inconvenience guests with questions. Malley returned from errands undertaken with his ordinary lack of flourish. "Report, sir," he said, producing it with the modest ceremony of a club rule. "Nothing to alarm a librarian. Mr. Sallows was seen leaving Pantile Court yesterday at 10 of the evening. He carried a newspaper and his civility, proceeded on foot to Larksmead by back way. No light seen after 11. Milk again untouched until noon. Receipts for coal remained theoretical." "Any sign of Bournemouth?" asked Purbright, no more than wry. "A card reached the treasurer," Malley said. "Pier at a happy angle. Words written with an unflustered pen. Benefiting, adequate, appropriate. Banks confirm a small withdrawal today by Mrs. Cordingley, widow, who praised the idea of joint purchasing. The manager regrets that the town has lately learned to speak in footnotes." "We shall not ask it to quote," Purbright said. Malley placed a slip upon the inspector's blotter, the carbon of a repair order from the railway, forwarded as a kindness by Mr. Rudge, who found kindness credible so long as it occurred in triplicate. A strap, brown with aspirations, had been mended at the luggage office the previous week. The note recorded the charge, which was insufficient, and the time, which was exact. The zero in the figure had been cancelled with that thin diagonal someone might employ in order to feel European at a counter. "Rudge is a man of observation," Malley said. "He reports the customer as a person who liked to improve noughts." Purbright put the slip beside Mrs. Venn's recollection and permitted them to take each other's measure. He did not smile. The expression would have been too broad for the room, but a small pleasure visited him as of a tune reappearing. Late in the afternoon, he was moved by idleness to step into the reading room. The lamps were already lit, though no meeting had adjourned. Their green hoods gave the books the look of a secret shared between furniture. Mr. Hames, the clerk, sat at a table copying out the minutes in his careful hand, which was the town's idea of eternity. "An improvement, Inspector," he said without looking up. "I find my errors more agreeable under this light." "Light improves everything," Purbright said. A thin woman in a knitted cardigan stood in the stacks, reading the titles with the intentness of one learning to be interested. She selected a volume on household accounts, flicked it to the index, and then replaced it in favor of a book of travel, open at Bournemouth. Palm trees, a pier, rooms with promise. She, too, replaced her choice. People rarely borrowed what they came to consider. On the central table lay a stack of circulars awaiting the conscientious hand that would pin them where notice might be taken without obligation. A new one among them announced, in a modest type that favored obedience, Ladies' Domestic Economy Lecture, Continuity in the Well-Run Home. The speaker's name was left to be filled in. It was not a revelation. It was not even a hint. It was the kind of coincidence a small town produces the way parlours produce antimacassars. Yet the word, continuity, rose from the paper with the self-importance of a phrase that expected accommodation. Purbright touched the sheet with one finger, as though turning a page that had become reluctant. Outside, the day's paleness was busy completing itself. He left the reading room and walked back without purpose to his desk. There, among other papers, 2 items had arranged themselves into neighbourliness. Mrs. Venn's card, plain and unfashionable, and a copy, forwarded by the stationer as a favour to the police, of the pale prospectus, the Robin and Quince, a joint venture in refined refreshment. The watermark, when tilted, produced the same ghostly crest as the letter she had once not sent, Chapelle and Grieve, Lincoln. Beneath it, in faint pressure from some hurried pen, a diagonal over an otherwise unassuming 0. Purbright returned both papers to their envelopes as one might close doors in a draught. He sat a while longer, doing nothing that would look like work. Then, because Day had left the windows without consultation, he reached to switch on the desk lamp and, recollecting green shades now steady above other tables, paused with his hand upon the switch. It occurred to him, not as an accusation, only as a possibility, that light offered freely to a room may be an invitation to conduct small private business under the sense of being approved, and that a town, desiring to be respected, may permit arrangements under the green glow that makes all reading look like virtue. Inspector Purbright preferred interviews conducted in rooms that looked incapable of excitement. The small office at the station, having been furnished in the spirit of unambitious permanence, obliged him. A single print of the county crest hung above a shelf that had made friends with forms. The window accepted light without hurry. A kettle, trained by generations of constables to behave modestly, breathed rather than boiled. At 11:03, Mr. Elwyn Sallows was shown in. He wore the same tweed that believed in October and had educated its elbows accordingly. His hair presented a discipline that might have been natural or bottled. The difference in Flaxborough was considered personal. He carried gloves of the kind that declined to admit they were ever new. "Good morning, Mr. Sallows," Purbright said, not rising more than civility required. "A small matter. The borough surveyor requests that we ascertain whether certain lodging arrangements meet the comfortable requirements of the bylaws. Too many cushions in one place and none in another, if you take my meaning." Sallows smiled as men do who admire a formula that does not trouble them. "One must sit somewhere, Inspector. I'm content to sit within the law." Sergeant Malley, who had already decided the chair for Mr. Sallows, indicated it with a hand that could not be offended. He took a place by the filing cabinet and suffered the role of furniture without degradation. "We have," Purbright continued, "received inquiries of the sort that flourish in minutes, whether weekly tenancies for furnished rooms require notification to the council when the room is occasionally not slept in." "It would be a pity," Sallows said easily, "if sleeping became compulsory. I prefer my bed to be available rather than prescriptive." Purbright allowed himself the smallest of nods, as though a point had been conceded in a game not expected to end. "Our curiosity extends only to entrances and exits. The council is fond of chains upon doors. It is a way of admitting that doors exist." "Chains preserve continuity," Sallows observed, "and a sense of occasion. One opens them to admit only those one intends." The word continuity, returning to the room like a polite relation, took a seat beside the Anderton lever binder on the desk. Purbright did not look at it. "You have taken a cottage," he said. "Larksmead." "Temporarily," Sallows replied, so promptly that the word accepted responsibility and sat down. "A trial of convenience. I have found, in moving between places, that privacy improves the temper. It is also kinder to tradesmen. One does not subject them to unnecessary conversations at front doors. Back gates are civilization's answer to sociability," Purbright said. "You settled your first week's rent? Cash?" Sallows considered the carpet, which had nothing to add. "Cash is friendlier to people who prefer to avoid arithmetic while standing." Malley did not move. He had learned long ago that expressions, like moths, were best observed without sudden gestures. "We must, I fear, inflict a small irritation," Purbright went on, his tone that of a clergyman announcing a hymn all present had long suspected. He drew toward him a flimsy form printed in the station's fatigued purple ink. Names, where known, addresses, where desired, a signature to assure the gods of lodging that their worship continues. Sallows accepted the form with appreciative gravity, as a man receives a prop he knows how to hold. He set it upon the desk blotter, then hesitated, patting his breast pocket for support. "Might I? I have the unmanly habit of requiring something beneath my hand." Purbright slid across a stiff blank, the back of a circular the station had received from the Swan Hotel offering private meeting rooms, "Discretion observed." The swan crest, embossed faintly at the top, looked like a courtesy extended to a different conversation. "Oblige me," Purbright said. Sallows bent, wrote with a deliberate, even hand that caressed its own neatness, and paused over the date before improving a figure with a thin diagonal. The zero had the look of an object not to be trusted alone. He then supplied Elwyn Sallows, the L unashamed, the W slightly apologetic. At the line "usual hours of occupation," he wrote "variable, evenings preferred," and, as if it were a kindness, underlined "preferred once." He returned the form. The hotel crest had received, without comment, the pressure of his pen. A swan lay watermark pale beneath the place where he had improved the knot. Purbright left the paper there, unstacked, the way one leaves a saucer to cool. "And now," Sallows said, permitting himself the level smile of a man who has cooperated successfully, "how may I further assist a council intent upon comfortable compliance?" "By telling us," Purbright said, "whether you host guests." Sallows considered the question as a pianist considers a particular note in a familiar piece. "Friends visit," he said, "if one allows friendship to include those whose acquaintance improves tea." "Tea improves most acquaintances," Purbright said. "We are asked to remember that cups chipped at the rim have been known to cause complaint." "I'm satisfied to pour into those that are whole," Sallows replied. "It is a personal economy." He settled back, not in the manner of a man inviting admiration, but as one who enjoys his own company. The hair tonic's civilized assertion hovered, making Malley want to open a window and not do it. Sallow's cuffs displayed a careful charity toward laundering. He did not cross his legs so much as arrange them to be found already crossed by anyone later asked. "We note," Purbright said, as if he had only just noticed, "that you favour rooms within walking distance of the reading room." "A tranquil place," Sallows agreed. "I confess a weakness for green-shaded lamps. They make even disappointing pamphlets look scholarly. One encounters there the sort of person who would be uncomfortable in a louder institution." "You attend meetings?" "I prefer the hour after meetings," Sallows said, and then, seeing no reason to withdraw the gift, added, "People are so much more trusting when they think they're in love, with an idea, with a plan, with their own prudence. It amounts to the same sensation and produces the same little carelessness." The sentence made no effort to hide its ancestry. It sat on the desk between them with the composure of a statement persuaded it had been general. Purbright, who had been taking no notes with his usual thoroughness, did not alter his face. He placed the form Sallows had signed upon another sheet of paper for no known reason, and asked whether the aspidistra at Larksmead thrived. "It does," Sallows said, pleased. "Continuity in a pot. I commend it." "Commendation is the least expensive virtue," Purbright said. Sallows' smile sharpened by a barely visible degree, as a blade is improved on a strop. "You suspect me of something I have not done." "On the contrary," Purbright said, "I suspect you of being careful." "A vice rarely punished," Sallows murmured. Malley shifted a little to remind his spine that it existed. He had not enjoyed the sentence about trust, though he admired the way the speaker had wrapped it. He looked at the signature again and took comfort, as always, in orthography. "Do you keep a bank account in the town, Mr. Sallows?" Purbright asked, without looking up. "I have ledgers sufficient to my principals," Sallows replied. "Banks are practical when one intends to forget things. I prefer to remember." Purbright did not inquire what it was he preferred to remember. There are kinds of remembering that cannot be authenticated by clerks. "Your references?" he asked instead. "Mrs. Goosey tells me you offered none and did not insist upon hers." "I offered punctuality," Sallows said, as if that were a sum. She accepted without requiring a receipt. He reached for his gloves and drew them on without haste, smoothing the wrist with a touch that might have been habit or affection. The gloves' seam caught briefly on the edge of the chair arm, and a fine grey thread paused in the air like a small argument. Sallows steadied it with one finger and persuaded it to retire. He looked up and found Purbright not watching. "I trust," he said, rising, "that I may continue to occupy my cottage and choose, with moderation, the hours in which I continue to occupy it. The council asks only that occupants be as predictable as drains," Purbright said. "We are less particular about what flows than about where it goes." Sallows laughed without sound. "Then I am within." "Statute." He shook hands as if completing an exchange that had benefited both parties in different ways. The hair tonic, faint now, seemed to approve. At the door, he paused with the courtesy of a man who does not like to surprise furniture. "If you should ever visit the reading room after the parish has completed its devotions to minutes," he said, "accept my recommendation. The chair beneath the left-hand lamp is kinder to backs. I have found it assists in the contemplation of small economies." "Advice," Purbright said, "is always welcome when it costs nothing." After Sallows had gone, carrying his gloves, his discretion, and an unacknowledged compliment to the sign, "No Smoking," Malley let his breath occupy the room again. "Contented soul," he observed. "He could be poured into any shape, I shouldn't wonder, and returned to whatever bottle he prefers." "Technical innocence," Purbright said. "A useful fabric. It wears well and holds a crease." Malley looked at the form the visitor had signed. "There's our diagonal," he said. "He can't leave a nought alone." "He likes to improve them," Purbright agreed. "No doubt he believes it a kindness." They were interrupted by Miss Fallow from the Advertiser, who had brought the weekly correction for dog licenses and an advanced sympathy for the weather. She inquired with the legitimate interest of a person whose desk receives confidences through letterboxes whether the police concert had settled on a time. Having been assured that it would surprise no one, she collected her umbrella from the corridor where umbrellas took counsel and left. "Shall I have a word with the guild about Mrs. Darbury's subscriptions?" Mally asked. "Gently," Purbright said. "No statements in rooms where tea is poured." Mally went, and the room reacquired its habit of appearing unoccupied. Purbright remained at the desk, looking not at the visitor's form but at the blotter beneath it. The faint swan impressed upon the paper had received the diagonal on the 0 with an untidy courtesy. He lifted the top sheet. The watermark, when tilted, produced a creature mid-glide, the crest's neck arched as if about to correct someone else's handwriting. From the corridor came a voice which the building, having no ear for gossip, nevertheless conducted efficiently. Miss Teatime, having chosen to be passing, had met the duty constable and was making herself agreeable for the benefit of posterity. "Most dreadfully shocked," she was saying in a tone reserved by experienced women for admiration of other people's restraint. "My dear man, I insist upon being shocked. It preserves tone. The moment one ceases to be shocked, one becomes a committee." The constable, who liked committees less than he liked rain, murmured approbation. Miss Teatime lowered her voice a half-inch and continued, "To think, a gentleman of mutual respect instructing our drains in punctuality. It is more than the guild can bear. They shall bear it beautifully." Her steps went away, bright and definite. Purbright put the signed form aside and drew toward him Mally's quiet arithmetic. Small withdrawals, regular as resolve, leaving accounts that remained outwardly prosperous. He read the lines again and then, not because it was necessary, but because some satisfactions insist upon being offered a companion, he reached for the visitor book in which certain callers were asked to inscribe themselves. The last entry, fresh, exact, read Elwyn Sallows, 1106. The 0, obediently, had been cancelled. The figure, 6, refinished from a 5. With a second thought that had not entirely concealed the first, he closed the book softly. The kettle, having understood the day's occasions, let out a sigh. Through the window, the town arranged its afternoon with the decorum of a place that believes the weather should be addressed respectfully. Purbright looked once more at the swan's crest, impressed faintest conscience on the scrap beneath Sallow's careful hand, and let the smallest of questions take a seat at the corner of his desk. Whether the gentleman's advice about the left-hand lamp had been offered from experience of comfort or from habit acquired while sitting where the room was least observed. Inspector Purbright arranged the meeting as one arranges the adjustment of a picture frame, privately, without ceremony, and with the expectation that only the angle would change. He invited Mr. Elwyn Sallows to the station on an afternoon that had decided to be fair if unremarkable. The small room, faithful to its calling, offered no assistance to drama. Its single window admitted a light that neither flattered nor reproached. The kettle was at that stage of opinion which precedes boiling but does not insist upon it. Sallows entered with the quiet of a man who imagines doors are too eager. Tweed, October's livery, fitted him as before. The hair tonic applied a decorous argument to the air. "Mr. Sallows," Purbright said, as though welcoming a parishioner to a pew, "forgive the summons, not really an inquiry, a conversation." "My time," Sallows replied, sitting where the chair already expected him, "is available to reason." "I shall not tax it," Purbright said. "You have been sociable in our town. We are grateful for sociability when it prefers rooms to pavements. You have taken a cottage, made friends with an aspidistra, admired the reading room. You have, I think, also discovered that Flaxborough values understanding more than evidence." Sallows inclined his head, as one salutes a general idea. "Understanding is cheaper to store," he said. "Exactly," Purbright agreed. It travels swiftly on foot. It can be carried in committees and set down in minutes. It also, when it enters rooms in which tea is poured, has the effect of making people careful about the words joint venture, mutual, respect, and economy. Our town has heard those words recently, in combinations that have failed to amuse. Sallow's expression did not alter so much as float. "I have encountered both prudence and tea," he said. "Neither has proved fatal." "I should dislike any fatality," Purbright murmured. "I mention only that certain ladies now possess receipts for small sums in your hand that they would prefer not to translate into stories. They will not prosecute their disappointment. They will, however, prefer to cease lending it moral support. You understand me?" Sallows considered the kettle, which had decided, out of delicacy, not to boil in front of him. "You propose an arrangement," he said. An interesting reversal. "Not an arrangement," Purbright replied. "A courtesy. We shall not trouble calendar or court. In return, you will discover that other towns possess chairs beneath green lamps, and that the road to them is shorter than you think." "To leave," Sallows said without bitterness, "is easy. To leave well is an art. You recommend the latter." "Art sustains the eye," Purbright said. "It also spares the nerves. 1 week, perhaps. A slight adjustment to your direction. You will find our railway's punctuality moderate but sufficient." Sallows leaned back a fraction. The movement suggested a man testing how much chair belonged to him. "It appears," he said, "that Flaxborough has perfected the unofficial method. One might admire it as a system." "It is a habit," Purbright said. "We are not proud of our habits. We are only accustomed." There was a pause that behaved like politeness. Sallows stood. He drew on his gloves with that charitable attention he gave to any surface over which his hand passed. The seam caught, hesitated, then submitted to a finger used to negotiation. "Thank you," he said, as if gratitude could be delivered without the inconvenience of feeling it. "You will permit me to conclude the week's domesticities." "We should be distressed," said Purbright almost seriously, "to inconvenience any grid, drain, or milkman." Sallow's smile chose discretion. He left the room with that tidy absence which is the last courtesy of men who intend to recall themselves elsewhere. Sergeant Malley, appearing in the doorway a moment later, observed the air in which the interview had hung and found it unclouded. "Departure notice, sir?" "An understanding," Purbright said, "which in our customs is the same instrument. Kindly keep half an eye upon Larksmead Cottage. 2 halves would seem to our visitor unkind." "Half an eye," Malley agreed. "I shall instruct the other to admire the view." Within the week, Flaxborough performed as advertised. The porter at the Midland reported a brown trunk with ambitions attempting the platform steps twice before consenting to be guided. The ticket read East, then suffered a correction to West, the diagonal across the 0, this time perfectly executed, as if even haste preferred style. The trunk contained neither scandal nor parcels of interest to customs. It weighed enough to have hopes. The cabman took his fare and refused to remember a face whose hair tonic had been pleasant. A milk bill at Larksmead stood without witnesses on the mantelpiece, making small appeals to the housekeeper's sense of local justice. The aspidistra, undisturbed, continued to summarize continuity. Mrs. Goosey, proprietor of the cottage, called at the station with the shy affront of a person compelled to mention money in a building that prefers duty. "He has left," she confided to Malley, "with as little trouble to the wallpaper as a gentleman could. Sheets laundered, coal unmarred by use. I found the chain oiled, which is Christian, and a card advising that morning dustmen are more moral than afternoon. As for the milk, well, 2 shillings and 4pence, which is not a sin worth praying over. But I shall be obliged if you will accept my remarks for your files, in case there is a plan to improve men who travel." "We accept remarks," Malley said with gravity. "They improve files." At the reading room, the green-shaded lamps continued to flatter paper. No one asked where they came from now. Gratitude, like drafts, loses strength in a week. The guild secretary's circular praising patience during transitions was carefully folded and stored beside two older circulars praising patience in other contexts. Patience in Flaxborough had acquired the sturdy domesticity of a kitchen chair. On Thursday, the advertiser arrived with its usual ceremony of postponing excitement. The personals page contained no 7331. It offered instead an impatience of quilting bees, a request for clean jam jars, a gentleman seeking a piano to behave itself during hymns, and lower down, a new notice which read, "A like-minded companion, theatre and travel, sought by cultured person of settled habits. Discretion assumed. Box 31. The phrasing was fresher than that of the late-lamented mutual respect in matters domestic. It suggested a less measurable affection. It also displayed a grammar not from the Swan, but from somewhere with upholstery. The compositor, having recovered his conscience, had placed no asterisks upon it. The zero in the date of insertion, Purbright noticed without needing to notice, was an honest circle unblemished by zeal. That same morning, Mrs. Darbury returned from Bournemouth. She entered Flaxborough by way of the 10:20 and the hairdresser's. The hair, which had suffered the restorative impulses of the seaside, now formed itself into a fringe of confidence over a brow that had formerly preferred modesty. She presented her new arrangement to the guild as one presents a donation. It was received with a silence in which only teacups moved. She offered no account of Bournemouth, except that it existed and had not disappointed her while. She disapproved of it. To those who required particulars, she supplied weather. To those who preferred hints, she offered benign regret that subscriptions were temporarily complicated. The word arrangements did not appear. She had discovered, perhaps on the pier, that it was a word that never obeyed. Miss Teatime, confronted by the return, deployed her manners with zest. "My dear," she exclaimed at a temperature just below boiling, "how we have missed your consistency. The hydrangeas have taken advantage." She added, for the benefit of any nearby moralists, "Rest cures are necessary. One must rest one's cures from time to time." She met Purbright on the High Street afterward, entirely by accident, which is to say, deliberately. "You have accomplished the one achievement for which our town rarely thanks anyone," she said. "You have prevented a scandal. This is why the borough cannot do without you. You spoil people's appetite for outrage." "It is their best meal," Purbright said. "And yet," she replied, pleased, "they will dine again. Do not be downcast. I am told there will be theatre and travel. The town will be spared mutual respect in favor of like-minded. What relief! We may now object on aesthetic grounds." "Do you propose to reply?" Purbright asked neutrally. "My diary," Miss Teatime said, "is already filled with the necessities of being admired. I shall observe, of course. There is no moral duty more refreshing than observing other people's intentions." At the station, Malley brought small news with the gravity of large competence. "Bank withdrawings have settled," he reported. "No further drips. Those that will not be remarked have ceased to require friends. The managers congratulate themselves upon prudence in arrears." "And Mrs. Darbury?" Purbright asked. "A deposit at her bank," Malley said, "no larger than a tulip bulb, and receipts at the guild presented with a smile that removes the need to total them. She has brought back a new climate from Bournemouth and is winding it into the committee." "I see," Purbright said. He did not. Larksmead Cottage, inspected at a distance only, had acquired a quiet. The caretaker's broom performed with extra formality, as if the floor were being given a reference. On the mantelpiece, Mrs. Goosey stuck the milkman's bill with a drawing pin whose head was a modest blue flower. She would be paid by next letting or not. Flaxborough allowed such liberties in proportion to its own decency. On Friday evening, the parish council, carried forward by its habit of improvement, sat under the new lamps and approved minutes that recorded gratitude for a gift to reading. Mr. Hames, the clerk, improved his hand by imitation. He made his zeros honest circles and left them so. For his part, Purbright resumed the discipline of morning tea. He read the advertiser without the hope that it would ever tell him anything quickly. He regarded the new notice, like-minded companion for theatre and travel, and found that, by the standards of the personals page, it had good posture. It asked for conversation in the tones of one who was willing to pay for tickets. He recognized none of Sallow's employment phrases in it. He heard instead a different ambition, a person inviting culture to assist in being introduced to themselves. He turned the page. Then, because habit is more nearly a conscience than people like to admit, he glanced back, not at the wording but at the tiny administrative numerals at the foot, the date and the compositor's initials, the quiet machinery by which flirtation becomes record. The 31 at the end of box 31 was written in the office hand, not the advertiser's. Still, the figure 1 bore a flick at its head, as if a pen accustomed to elegance had returned. The 3, slightly overwrought, looked like a 2 improved with second thoughts. No diagonal line struck any zero. No hair tonic troubled the paper. He smiled faintly, not at the mystery, but at the town, which had again elected for the comfort of understanding over the dissatisfaction of proof. He folded the paper, set it beside the teapot, and watched a small, respectable curl of steam rise, behave itself, and disappear into a room that had room for more understanding if required. Outside, Flaxborough made its usual credible sounds. A bicycle bell apologizing for itself, a bus finding second gear reluctantly, the postman performing optimism with envelopes. In the distance, the reading room's lamps would already be preparing to dignify the evening. And somewhere, quite possibly within reach of box 31, someone was deciding whether to be companionable in public or practical in private. Purbright did not decide for them. He allowed himself, instead, the smallest unrecorded question, no larger than a pinhole through which a thread might be drawn, whether like-minded would prove less arithmetical than mutual respect, or merely a new way for the town to enact its old preference, that arrangements are best kept within reach of teacups and away from minutes. Then he turned, cheerfully incurious, to the notices of furniture for sale and a second-hand bassoon that, if believed, had never misbehaved in public.